I've tried all kinds of stuff. For example, around the time I met Pavlos first, I was doing an experiment. And I was asking some advice from him, I remember, because it was not throwing up the results I expected. I was in Japan at the time, and I had people doing interviews and being interviewed. And I would have them, it was all done under different conditions. So you would be interviewed with by a person who was approximately your own age. You would be interviewed by a person who was significantly older than you, in your own estimation. You would also be interviewed by a person who was significantly younger. What I was trying to do is because in Japan age is seen as a variable that is highly rated in terms of how it affects language. I was deliberately trying to manipulate the equality within the exam, and I couldn't. Because even older people being interviewed by younger people behaved in a way that they had obviously been trained to. This is the person with the power, this is the person who's examining me. So I wasn't able to manipulate, at least not systematically. Obviously you get an occasional, in any test you get an occasional person who sort of bucks the trend, you know, but it's very strange. You know, in a test, we talk about equality. In a conversation, it's only equal if both people have had equal control over a topic, for example. Can you imagine if you're examining somebody and they say in the middle of the topic, oh, I'm not bored with this, let's talk about something else. It just doesn't happen because people want to pass the test, basically. So it's unlikely that we're going to have these things happen. And even when they do, then we get the comparability. So if we meet together and have a conversation, and if we meet together and have a conversation, can we compare those conversations? Even if we're talking about the same topic, we really can't, because the conversation is co-constructed. It's developed by the two people or the three people or whatever who are involved in it. It's not a single act. I may have a contribution, but even my contribution is co-constructed by the person I'm interacting with, because that person is co-constructing with me. So the whole thing is coming together, it's between us, it's built up by us. So making comparisons across conversations is quite difficult, I would think. Probably impossible. And why would you want to? The other issue is how linguistically complex will these things be? Because in a lot of the tests that we see a very narrow range of tasks, or a very narrow range of formats. What happens is we tend to get the same kind of language over and over again. So we're not generating a complex picture of language to be able to base any prediction, if you like, of a person's ability to perform linguistically in a particular conversational setting or domain. So we're not getting the broad range of language. So we're always going to be limited. And I realized when I was doing this talk, when I was putting it together, that it starts like on a sort of a skeptical note and goes kind of downhill most of the day. So I was obviously not in one of my happier moods, maybe because Manchester United lost the Champions League last week, and then I went to Reading. We're playing in the Championship playoff at Wembley on Monday. I went to that, we lost again, so maybe I was having a bad day at the office. But it does get a little bit better. The Foreign Services Institute in America, in the meantime, were the first to sort of try to formalize assessment of speaking. But I should really say, and something that's really interesting is, a lot of stuff has come out about testing of speaking in Cambridge over the last number of years with the publication of a few books. And it's been interesting. And one of the most interesting thing for me is if you look at the CPE book from, I think it's about 2003, Milanovic and Weir, look up rating or marking of the speaking test. You won't find it until the 70s. Because they might, and justifiably, say that they introduced formalized, standardized tests of speaking, if you like, 100 years ago. but they didn't standardize the assessment system until the last few decades. So there was none, there wasn't a rating scale. The best, and that's all I can find out. Nobody seems to know. I think it's hilarious. Because if you're going to talk about it, tell us the whole story. Because it's all linked. We had a very interesting chat with a Swede during the break here. It was really interesting stuff because he's looking at the underlying construct, what's happening, but what's really happening. Not just what we think is happening, what's really going on. And unless we link the test taker to the test context, to the scoring system, we don't know what's going on. We need all three bits of information, as you'll see in a few minutes. In the mid-50s, this test was developed mainly as a result of the Japanese and Korean wars. The American Foreign Services Institute decided that they needed tests of all foreign languages, particularly strategically important foreign languages, for their strategic interests, shall we say. So that's where it came from. That's where the impetus came from all of these tests. In the same way as the Maryland project that's going on at the moment is driven by the State Department in the States. We're looking at high-level assessment of very high-level candidates, trying to identify the differences between native speakers and non-native speakers at a very high level, which is very interesting stuff, very political, but all driven by the same military interest, which is, fair enough. Tests have to come from somewhere, I suppose. It was an interview format, and it was famous because they were the first to produce a formal rating scale. It was an analytic scale with things like accent and grammar and vocabulary. Everything was laid out, and it was made very clear that it was built around the scale. The scale itself, of course, never worked as it was originally designed, but that didn't really matter. It did work in various other ways. It's been criticized, of course, because it doesn't have a theoretical base. It's just purely people sitting down and just writing a scale. They didn't really think about the theory. And even when it was updated to the interagency language roundtable scale, it never really was based on a proper theory of language or language development. The other big problem with these tests, and all the versions of that have come since then, is the test begins with me as an examiner giving you as a test taker a task. I decide where the task is set. If I have an impression that you're high level, I give you a high level task. If I have a feeling that you're not a high level, I come in a middle level task. It's been shown for 20 years that it doesn't work because people only vary about 2 steps away from the first task they're given. So if the examiner gets it wrong at the start, you're in trouble as a test taker, and you're unlikely to be able to dig your way out of it. Of course, a huge amount of resources and energy goes into examiner training to try to alleviate that problem. But the biggest worry is that there's a lack of validation. We don't really know what it's testing. But when I was doing this, I was thinking, well, there must be something positive. Let's go to this website. If you're interested, that's the website. We're not going to go now. I didn't realize that I would have a web, but we could go. And what's fantastically interesting about it is it's all about the scale. There's nothing about the test. What do you ask the student? What are the tasks? You're not going to find out looking at the website. They're not even mentioned. It's all about the scale. And for me, that's just fascinating. That you can create a scale and assume that it's going to work everywhere with all these different people in these different languages. And it's just mind-bogglingly daft that you could come up with that sort of an idea. How can you do it? Wow, it's brilliant. Don't make a task. Don't worry about tasks. Just dream up something and then just put them on the scale. That's fantastic. I don't know how it works. Anyway. So let's look at some of the formats and stuff that are out there that we were all familiar with, so I'm not going to waste a lot of time on this. We have the pair, the group, the one-to-one interview. These are all commonly used now. And now, thanks to Pearson, we have a machine that's looking at estimating a person's facility to use or for use. I can never remember which is the right term. It doesn't actually claim to tell you a person's level of spoken language. It tells you their facility to use it. So it's a kind of predictive test. So that's why I put it away from the others, because it's a different beast. Essentially, the first ones work on in terms of human interaction and our observation. So that's what the basis is. The other one, the one-to-one interview, can be human or machine interaction. Nowadays, we have talking heads that look pretty lifelike. There are even tests out there where you can decide on the gender and the color, etc., of your examiner by selecting various features and hitting a button, and then the speaking head that talks to you on the computer is a person that you have designed. So I wanted to do some of that years ago, but we didn't have the technology at the time. But it would be very interesting to see how people would interact with talking heads that they design or talking heads that are imposed, and then manipulate the different talking heads. I'm beginning to think that it wouldn't have the difference that it would have had 20 years ago. The scoring systems that are used, well, we have humans and we have machines. And we saw a reason I nearly missed my talk, I was looking at a really interesting poster on machine marking of writing, which is another interesting area. So we're going to see more and more of this kind of stuff. Machines are going to become more and more important in assessment of blindingly obvious. But what we need to know is what they're doing. Because the humans are doing it either live or recorded, and they're using different types of scales. So it's a holistic, an analytic, or an indigenous. Indigenous means that it's a scale devised for a particular task in a particular domain. So it wouldn't be widely usable. It's only usable for that particular task usually, or at the most in that particular domain. So we need to be careful with all of these things, because we know, for example, that live is different to recorded. We know that there's systematic differences in the scores awarded to live compared to recorded. They're lower for recorded. And partly that may be because when we're interacting live, face-to-face, there's more happening than just language. People have an ability to get you to listen to them, and others don't. And that ability is going to help them get a better score in the test. Whereas in a recording, you're missing that, especially if it's an audio recording. And even if it's a video recording, you're missing parts of it. We've even done analysis, and when I was doing my own PhD work, I had about 600, just under 600 people who had taken an FCE test. And a byproduct of it, I wasn't looking at comparing the observer score to the face-to-face examiner score. I did that later. I just had these numbers, and I couldn't resist analysing them. And I found that there's a significant, though fairly small, but still a meaningful difference between the examiner's mean and the observer's mean. The examiner gives a higher score than the observer, and that's consistent. And I'm sure if we had access to a very large data set like Cambridge would have, we would be able to show that right across all of their exams. That's really interesting, because there's obviously something different happening. It's not the same. It's not the same. If you listen to me live, you might say, well, that was a really rubbish talk. And then you might say, well, you know, listen to this, it's really crap. And then somebody listens to it and they'll think, yeah, it's really bad. You know, this guy is useless. He's not saying anything we don't know already. But I hope that at least you're listening. Nobody's fallen asleep yet, although John